There are true crime stories that are shocking. There are those that are deeply disturbing. And then there are the rare few that sound almost too bizarre to be real. The case of Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell belongs to that final category. This is the story of a suburban mother and a doomsday author. Two people who should have lived ordinary lives, but instead built a twisted belief system that ended in murder. It is a story of two children, Tylee Ryan and J.J. Vallow, whose faces appeared on missing posters across the country, their absence haunting every headline, every interview, every tearful plea. And it is a story of how faith, when warped by obsession and delusion, can become deadly. To neighbors and friends, Lori Vallow looked like a loving mother, vibrant, charismatic, and always with a smile. Chad Daybell was a small-town author and family man, known in his community for his books about the end of the world. But behind their outward appearances was a secret relationship, a dangerous theology, and a pact that would eventually claim multiple lives. Lori's husband, Chad's wife, and most tragically, Lori's own children. What makes this case so chilling is not only the loss of innocent lives, but the way it all unfolded. Every step was justified, in their minds, by prophecy. They spoke of light and dark spirits, of zombies inhabiting bodies, of themselves as leaders chosen to guide the faithful into the end times. These were not idle fantasies. These were ideas that dictated who lived, who died, and who was discarded as an obstacle to their plan. And yet, as shocking as the story is, it is also a cautionary tale about the power of belief, about how two people can create a world of their own making, and then convince themselves and sometimes others that nothing outside of that world matters. As we step into this case together, we'll trace the timeline from Lori and Chad's first meeting, to the deaths that followed, to the discovery of shallow graves that revealed the unthinkable truth. We'll explore their belief system, how it gave them permission to kill, and how love, delusion, and manipulation fused into one of the darkest pacts in modern American crime. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Dark Truths, true crime stories, where we dive deep into the cases that shock, disturb, and leave us questioning how far human beings can fall. And if you'd like to support the channel even more, consider joining as a member. Members can request cases and topics, and I'll bring those stories to life for you. Your support helps me keep telling these stories, and together, we make sure the victims are never forgotten. Now, let's begin with the timeline. How two ordinary lives spiraled into a story of prophecy, delusion, and murder. The timeline of events. To understand how Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell went from ordinary lives to being known as a doomsday couple, we need to walk through the timeline carefully. This story does unfold in a single shocking moment, but rather in a series of events, small cracks that became chasms, ignored warnings that became tragedies, and decisions that slowly pulled two people away from reality until there was no turning back. Let's start with Lori Vallow, long before she ever met Chad. Lori was born in 1973 and grew up in a close-knit Mormon family. From the outside, she seemed like someone who had it all. She was attractive, charismatic, and the type of person who could light up a room. But those who knew her well noticed a restlessness. Lori was always searching for something more excitement, more purpose, more meaning. By her mid-40s, she had already been married 4 times. Each relationship started with passion, but ended in conflict, and each time, Lori moved on quickly, as if she were chasing an ideal that kept slipping just out of reach. Her 4th marriage, to Charles Vallow, looked promising at first. Charles was steady, hardworking, and patient. He provided a comfortable life and adored Lori's children. Lori had a teenage daughter, Tylee Ryan, from a previous marriage, and in 2014, Charles and Lori adopted Joshua J.J. Vallow, a sweet little boy with autism who was a biological grandson of Charles' sister, Kay. For a while, it seemed like Lori had finally found stability. Photos from this time show smiling family vacations, holidays together, and Lori appearing as a devoted mother. But behind the smiles, cracks were forming. Lori's religious devotion had always been part of her identity, but started to take on a new edge. She became fascinated with end times prophecies and fringe spiritual ideas that went far beyond the mainstream teachings of her church. She listened to podcasts, read obscure books, and spoke about visions of the future. For Charles, this was unsettling. He wanted a stable life for their children. But Lori seemed to be drifting further into obsession. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away in Idaho, Chad Daybell was building his own reputation. Chad lived with his wife, Tammy, and their 5 children in Rexburg. To neighbors, they seemed like an ordinary, religious family. Tammy worked as a school librarian and was known for her kindness and dedication to her kids. Chad, however, was focused on his writing. He ran a small publishing company and wrote dozens of self-published novels centered on near-death experiences and the apocalypse. Chad claimed he had seen beyond the veil of life and death. He spoke openly about visions he had received, and he wrote about a coming apocalypse that would reshape the world. His audience wasn't large, but it was devoted. In small circles of the LDS community, Chad was seen as something of a prophet, a man who could interpret signs of the end times. In October 2018, Lori and Chad's paths crossed at a religious conference in Utah. Their connection was immediate. Chad told Lori that they had been married in multiple past lives. He told her she was a goddess, chosen to play a central role in the final battle between good and evil. For Lori, who had always craved a sense of purpose larger than life itself, this was intoxicating. She wasn't just a suburban mother. Anymore, she was divine, chosen, special. From that moment on, everything began to change. By early 2019, Lori's marriage to Charles was unraveling. Charles noticed Lori's increasing obsession with Chad and his teachings. He told police and friends that Lori believed she was preparing for the end of the world, that she no longer recognized him as her husband, and that she believed he had been possessed by a dark spirit. Charles was desperate. He filed for divorce and sought help from law enforcement. In body cam footage from one encounter with police, Charles looks exhausted and fearful. He warns them that Lori believes she is a god preparing for the apocalypse and that she has threatened his life. But Lori was convincing. To the officers, she seemed calm and rational. She brushed off Charles's concerns and charmed her way through the encounter. Charles was left looking paranoid, even though his warnings were chillingly accurate. On July 11th, 2019, Charles went to Lori's rental home in Chandler, Arizona, to pick up JJ. Inside the house were Lori, her teenage daughter Tylee, and her brother Alex Cox. According to their account, an argument broke out. Tylee emerged with a baseball bat to defend her mother, and Alex claimed that Charles took the bat and threatened him. Alex responded by retrieving a handgun and shooting Charles dead. When police arrived, Lori was disturbingly calm. She laughed, smiled, and acted as though nothing serious had happened. Neighbors later said she even hosted a pool party later that day. Charles's death was ruled self-defense, and the case was closed. But in hindsight, it was the first in a series of deaths that cleared the path for Lori and Chad to be together. Just weeks after Charles's death, Lori moved to Rexburg, Idaho, with Tylee and JJ. This was no random choice. Rexburg was Chad Daybell's home, and in their apocalyptic worldview, it was also a gathering place for the chosen survivors of the end times. Tylee and JJ were suddenly pulled out of their familiar world, away from friends and relatives who might have noticed something was wrong. On September 8th, 2019, Lori, Tylee, JJ, and Alex took a trip to Yellowstone National Park. A photo from that day shows Tylee standing with her brother and uncle, smiling in front of the geyser. It would be the last known image of her alive. Within days, Tylee vanished. Lori gave vague and shifting explanations for her absence. Sometimes she said Tylee was at college. Other times, she claimed Tylee didn't want to talk. But no one outside the inner circle saw her again. 2 weeks later, on September 23rd, JJ was seen at school for the last time. Teachers noticed he seemed tired and distracted. That day, Lori unenrolled him, telling the school she would homeschool. After that, JJ disappeared. Family members quickly grew alarmed. Kay and Larry Woodcock, JJ's grandparents, began demanding answers. They called Lori, texted her, begged her to explain where the children were. Lori deflected, lied, or ignored them altogether. When police conducted a welfare check in late November, Lori claimed JJ was staying with family friends in Arizona. Investigators quickly discovered this was false. Lori and Chad, sensing the net closing in, fled to Hawaii. Meanwhile, another tragedy struck. On October 9th, 2019, Chad's wife Tammy reported that a masked man had tried to shoot her with what she believed was a paintball gun. 10 days later, on October 19th, Tammy was found dead in her bed. Chad claimed she had gone to sleep coughing and never woke up. She was just 49 years old and in good health. Chad refused an autopsy, insisting it was natural causes. Barely 2 weeks later, on November 5th, 2019, Lori and Chad were married on a beach in Hawaii. Photos show them smiling, carefree, as though the deaths and disappearances surrounding them didn't exist. For family members of Tylee and JJ, this was incomprehensible. Lori's children were missing, Tammy was dead, and yet Lori and Chad were celebrating. By December, the case had become national news. Where are the children became the haunting question repeated on every network and in every press conference. Lori and Chad refused to cooperate. They offered no explanations, no concern, no urgency. They appear to be living in their own world, untouched by the desperation around them. Finally, in June 2020, investigators searching Chad's property in Rexburg made a horrific discovery. In the backyard, they uncovered the remains of Tylee Ryan and J.J. Vallow. Tylee's body had been dismembered and burned, leaving behind fragments of bone and ash. J.J.'s small body was found wrapped in plastic and duct tape, buried in a shallow grave. The discovery ended the search but left the world stunned. The smiling children whose faces had haunted missing posters were now victims of their own mother and her new husband's delusions. Chad was arrested on the spot, taken away in handcuffs as investigators combed through his property. Lori, already in custody for desertion and obstruction, now faced charges of murder. The fairy tale image of a chosen couple, destined to lead God's people into the apocalypse, collapsed under the weight of the truth. They were killers. And with that discovery, the timeline of Lori and Chad's descent into darkness was complete. From a religious conference in 2018 to shallow graves in 2020, two lives that spiraled out of control, leaving behind devastation that could never be undone. The belief system, light, dark, and the language of delusion. If the timeline explains what happened, then the belief system explains why. Because in order to understand how a mother could stand by while her children vanished, how a husband could watch his wife die and remarry weeks later, how two adults could justify lies, deception, and murder, you have to step into the strange world Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell built together. A world where scripture, fantasy, and delusion collided until the line between faith and fanaticism disappeared completely. Chad Daybell's writings had long focused on the apocalypse. For years, he had self-published novels filled with visions of the end times. His stories were marketed as fiction, but to those who listened closely, they were messages disguised as entertainment. He claimed he had experienced multiple near-death experiences that allowed him to see beyond the veil. He said he could communicate with angels, interpret divine signs, and even predict death. To some, he was eccentric. To others, he was prophetic. By the time Lori met Chad in 2018, he had cultivated a small but loyal following within fringe groups of the LDS community. These weren't mainstream teachings. These were private circles, podcasts, conferences, places where people hungry for answers beyond the church's official doctrine gathered to hear about visions, prophecies, and secrets of the last days. Lori, who had always been drawn to spiritual intensity, was captivated. She believed Chad wasn't just a man with ideas. He was a prophet with authority. One of Chad's central teachings was the concept of light and dark spirits. Every person on earth, he said, could be classified as either light or dark. Light spirits were aligned with God. Dark spirits were under the influence of Satan. It was a simple binary that reduced the complexity of human life into categories. And it didn't stop there. Chad claimed some people weren't themselves at all. Their original spirits had left their bodies, replaced by dark entities. These people were no longer truly human. They were zombies. The language was chilling, but what made it deadly was how Lori absorbed it. Once she accepted the idea, anyone in her life could be recast as something less than human. A husband could become a zombie. A child could become an obstacle. A wife could become a dark spirit standing in the way of destiny. And once that transformation occurred in Lori and Chad's minds, the rules of morality no longer applied. Killing wasn't murder. It was removing a dark entity. Charles Vallow, Lori's fourth husband, was one of the first to be labeled. Lori told friends that Charles was no longer Charles, that his body had been taken over by a dark spirit named Ned Schneider. When Charles tried to intervene and save his marriage, Lori framed him as an enemy. His death at the hands of Alex Cox was explained away within this twisted framework. Charles wasn't her husband anymore. He was a dark soul, but the system didn't stop with Charles. It extended to the people Lori was supposed to love most, her children. Tylee Ryan was 16, strong-willed, and protective of her little brother JJ. She questioned her mother, pushed back against Lori's erratic behavior, and refused to simply go along. That defiance made her dangerous in Lori's eyes. Soon, Tylee was labeled dark. JJ, too, was eventually described as possessed. Friends testified that Lori claimed JJ had become difficult, that he was under the influence of dark forces. In Lori's world, they were no longer children. They were obstacles, and obstacles could be removed. Chad's theology also included the idea of multiple mortal probations, essentially past lives. He told Lori that she had lived before, that they had been married in previous lifetimes, and that together they had played great roles in human history. For a woman who had always sought purpose, this was irresistible. She wasn't just Lori. She was eternal. She was chosen. She was a goddess destined to stand beside Chad in the final days. Their conversations reflected this obsession with destiny. Lori began telling friends that she was one of the chosen, that she would live to see the return of Christ, that she was preparing to gather the 144,000 faithful spoken of in the book of Revelation. She claimed she had powers. She believed she could no longer be killed. She believed she had been called to lead. For Chad, this was validation of his role as prophet. For Lori, it was the identity she had always been searching for. Together, they formed a closed loop of reinforcement, each feeding the other's delusions. By late 2018, Chad had also introduced a sense of urgency into the mix. He predicted that the world would end in July 2020. Earthquakes, natural disasters, foreign invasions, he described a cascade of chaos that would sweep the earth, leaving only the chosen to rebuild. For Lori, this meant there wasn't time for normal life. The clock was ticking. Every day brought them closer to the apocalypse. Why worry about mortgages, schools, or jobs when the world itself was ending? This countdown created permission. If the end was near, then ordinary laws and rules no longer mattered. If the end was near, then love and loyalty to children could be overshadowed by loyalty to a divine mission. If the end was near, then murder wasn't a crime, it was a necessity. Lori and Chad also began keeping spiritual scorecards of people around them. They assigned ratings of light or dark, labeling friends, family, and acquaintances. These ratings weren't arbitrary. They were maps of who could be trusted and who had to be eliminated. A low rating meant someone was sliding into darkness. A 0 rating meant someone was a zombie. Once that designation was made, there was no turning back. Perhaps the most chilling element of this belief system was how it rewrote love itself. In the normal world, love is about protection, about sacrifice, about caring for others even when it's difficult. In Lori and Chad's world, love became conditional. If you were light, you were worthy of protection. If you were dark, you were marked for removal. Lori could look at her children and no longer see them as her own. She could look at her husband and no longer see a partner. She could look at Tammy, Chad's wife, and see only an obstacle. Love was replaced with ideology. It is easy to dismiss this as delusion, but it is important to recognize how belief functioned here as manipulation. For Chad, the theology gave him control. He could define who was light and who was dark. He could decide who was safe and who was expendable. That authority made him powerful. For Lori, it gave her justification. It silenced doubt, numbed guilt, and allowed her to betray her own instincts as a mother. Together, they created a system where every monstrous act was reframed as holy. In their private conversations, Chad and Lori spoke about building places of refuge, so-called translation camps, where the chosen would gather. They told followers they were preparing supplies, gathering loyal believers, and readying themselves for the great cleansing. And in that plan, the children simply did not fit. Tylee was too questioning. JJ required too much care. In their distorted worldview, the children were liabilities. They were not part of the 144,000. They were not part of the mission. And so, they were marked. This is what makes the belief system so terrifying. It wasn't just strange ideas spoken at conferences. It wasn't just bizarre conversations between two lovers. It was a framework that determined life and death. It was a theology of exclusion that became a theology of execution. Looking back now, many wonder whether Chad and Lori truly believed these things, or whether beliefs were simply a cover for selfishness, lust, and greed. The truth may be both. Belief gave them language to mask their desires. It gave them justification to silence conscience. It gave them the confidence to smile at cameras, lie to police, and plan murders while convincing themselves they were righteous. But whatever the balance between delusion and manipulation, the outcome was the same. Death. Charles Vallow, Tammy Daybell, Tylee Ryan, J.J. Vallow. Each life ended, each justified, each erased by a belief system that had no room for love, no room for family, no room for humanity. And that is the chilling heart of this case. It was not just about two people who lost control. It was about two people who built a world where control itself meant deciding who deserved to live. In the end, the belief system didn't save them. The world didn't end in July 2020. The prophecies failed. The apocalypse never came. But by then, the damage was done. Lives were lost. Families were shattered. And Lori and Chad's theology of light and dark had already left its mark on the Earth's shallow graves that told the real story. The Pact, lovers, manipulators, and co-conspirators. At the center of this story is not just a belief system, and not just a timeline of deaths. At the center of the story is a pact, an agreement between two people that bound them together in delusion, in secrecy, and in crime. Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell weren't just partners in faith or partners in romance. They were co-conspirators. Each needed the other, each reinforced the other, and together they created a reality so dangerous that it consumed nearly everyone who stood too close. When Lori first met Chad at that religious conference in Utah in 2018, it wasn't just a flirtation, it was recognition. Chad told her she was special, that she was destined, that they had been together in past lives. And Lori, who had spent her whole life searching for purpose, saw in Chad the validation she craved. He was a prophet. She was a goddess. They weren't ordinary anymore. They were eternal beings with a mission. That was the beginning of the pact. But like any pact, it needed fuel. For Chad, the fuel was control. For Lori, the fuel was escape. Chad was a man who had lived a quiet life. Small town, small publisher, modest recognition. But through Lori, he suddenly had power. He could shape her reality. He could tell her who was light, who was dark, who was safe, who was dangerous. And Lori would believe him. Every word. That kind of influence is intoxicating. It turned Chad from a fringe author into a self-styled prophet whose words carried the weight of destiny. For Lori, the pact offered something different. She was a woman who'd been a wife, a mother, a caretaker. She had lived lives defined by responsibility, feeding children, keeping up a home, navigating the daily grind. But with Chad, she wasn't just Lori anymore. She was exalted. She was immortal. She was free. Free from the expectations of being a wife to Charles, a mother to Tylee, a caretaker to JJ. With Chad, she could abandon those roles and see herself as something far greater. Together, the pact gave them permission. And once two people decide that nothing outside their bond matters, not family, not children, not morality, anything becomes possible. Friends later described how quickly Lori's loyalty shifted. She had been married to Charles for years. Yet after meeting Chad, she began speaking about Charles as if he were already gone. Chad told her Charles was dark, even possessed. Lori repeated this to others, saying he was no longer a husband but a zombie named Ned Schneider. When Charles tried to intervene, to pull her back, the pact rejected him. His death in July 2019 wasn't random. It was the first casualty of the bond between Lori and Chad. The same pattern followed with the children. Tylee was strong-willed, defiant, unwilling to submit to her mother's strange new worldview. JJ needed constant care, patience, and attention. In the ordinary world, these would be normal challenges of parenthood. In Lori and Chad's world, they became liabilities. Chad told Lori the children were dark. Lori accepted it. The Pact demanded removal. Even Tammy, Chad's loyal wife of nearly 3 decades, was eventually cast aside. Tammy had stood by Chad as he wrote his books, raised their children, and built his small publishing house. But when Lori entered the picture, Tammy became an obstacle. For the Pact to thrive, she had to be erased. And she was. 10 days after reporting a strange masked man in her driveway, she was dead in her bed at 49 years old. This is how the Pact worked. It was a filter. Anyone who supported Lori and Chad's mission was included. Anyone who questioned them, resisted them, or stood in the way was marked for elimination. And around them, there were helpers. Alex Cox, Lori's brother, played the role of enforcer. He was loyal to Lori, perhaps manipulated by her charisma, perhaps convinced by her beliefs. Alex was the one who pulled the trigger on Charles Vallow. He was present when the children disappeared. His phone records later placed him near the burial sites on Chad's property. Alex died himself in December 2019, reportedly of natural causes, but his role in the Pact was undeniable. There were also friends who were drawn in, at least temporarily. Melanie Gibb, one of Lori's closest friends, recalled being told about the light and dark system, about zombies, about the mission to gather the chosen. For a time, she listened, but when the children went missing and Lori lied about their whereabouts, Melanie's loyalty fractured. She recorded conversations, provided evidence, and ultimately testified against Lori. What becomes clear is that the Pact was sustained by secrecy and lies. Lori lied to police. Chad lied to family. They lied to friends, to neighbors, even to strangers. When asked who the children were, Lori smiled and claimed they were safe. When Tammy died, Chad insisted it was natural causes. When police closed in, they fled to Hawaii and pretended to live as newlyweds on a beach, all while the world demanded answers. But the Pact couldn't last. Lies can only carry so far. And when the shallow graves were uncovered in June 2020, the Pact was exposed for what it truly was, a union built on death. What makes this part of the story so disturbing is how ordinary it looks on the surface. 2 people meet, fall in love, and start imagining a new life together. That's not unusual. But what is unusual, what is horrifying, is how quickly their bond turned lethal. How love turned into conspiracy. How devotion turned into destruction. The psychology of this is complex. Was Chad manipulating Lori? Was Lori manipulating Chad? Or was it a true meeting of 2 minds, each equally committed to delusion? Some argue that Chad was a puppeteer, feeding Lori's fantasies and exploiting her devotion. Others argue that Lori was a driving force, charismatic and commanding, pulling Chad deeper into her world. The truth is likely both. Each manipulated the other. Each reinforced the other. And that mutual reinforcement is what made them so dangerous. Because if it had been only Chad, his ideas might have stayed in books and small conferences. If it had been only Lori, her obsession might have burned out or been contained by family intervention. But together, they created a closed universe, impermeable to reason, sealed off from reality. A universe where they were the chosen leaders, where others were pawns, and where murder was destiny. The Pact was not written on paper. It was not spoken in vows. It was etched in every lie, every label of dark spirit, every grave that was dug. It was a pact sealed in blood, the blood of spouses, of children, of anyone who threatened the bond between Lori and Chad. And like all pacts built on lies and death, it eventually collapsed, but not before leaving behind destruction that can never be undone. This is the essence of the Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell story. A pact between lovers who became co-conspirators. A pact that turned faith into fanaticism and love into murder. Arrest, trial, and conviction. when investigators unearthed the remains of Tylee Ryan and J.J. Vallow in June 2020. The world finally had the answer it had been demanding for months. But the answer was unbearable. The smiling children on missing posters were gone, their lives stolen, their futures erased. For the first time, the smiling facade of Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell shattered. The so-called Doomsday couple were no longer eccentric visionaries talking about the end of the world. They were murder suspects. And what followed was a legal battle that would expose every secret, every lie, every detail of their dark pact. The morning of June 9th, 2020, law enforcement descended on Chad Daybell's quiet Rexburg property with shovels, ground-penetrating radar, and cadaver dogs. Neighbors watched in stunned silence as investigators dug through patches of earth, carefully peeling back layers of dirt. Hours passed, and then came the first grim discovery. Buried near a tree in the backyard was a body of 7-year-old J.J. Vallow, wrapped tightly in black plastic and bound with duct tape. Nearby, in another shallow grave, investigators found the remains of Tylee Ryan. Her body had been dismembered, burned, and reduced to fragments of bone and ash. It was a scene that even seasoned officers struggled to process. When the announcement was made that the children had been found, reporters described the cries of family members, the anguish of grandparents Kay and Larry Woodcock, who had fought tirelessly to find JJ. For them, it was a confirmation of their worst fears. For the public, it was a gut-wrenching end to a mystery that had consumed headlines for nearly a year. That same day, police arrested Chad Daybell. Footage shows him being handcuffed on the side of a rural Idaho road, his face expressionless, as if still refusing to grasp that the world he had built was collapsing around him. Lori Vallow was already in custody, having been arrested months earlier in Hawaii on charges of desertion and obstruction. Now, both faced murder charges. The legal system moved slowly, but with each hearing, each new document, the horrifying details became clearer. Prosecutors alleged that Lori and Chad, driven by their apocalyptic beliefs and desire to be together, conspired to kill Charles Vallow, Tammy Daybell, and Lori's own children. They were also charged with fraud, continuing to collect Social Security benefits intended for the children long after they were dead. In court, the once smiling Lori appeared transformed. At early hearings, she walked with a grin, her hair styled, her demeanor almost smug. It was as if she believed the rules of the world still didn't apply to her. But as months turned into years, the weight of the evidence bore down. Witnesses lined up to describe the bizarre conversations about zombies and light versus dark spirits. Friends testified about being told that JJ and Tylee were possessed. Prosecutors laid out text messages, phone records, and digital evidence that placed Alex Cox, the loyal brother who acted as enforcer, at the very locations where children were buried. The courtroom became the stage where the delusion was stripped bare. Audio recordings captured Lori and Chad discussing their visions. Journal entries from Chad described his so-called prophecies, ranking people around him as light or dark. Witnesses describe how Lori insisted she was chosen by God, immune from death, destined to lead. Piece by piece, the prosecution painted a picture of two people who had abandoned reality, replacing it with theology that made murder righteous. By the time Lori's trial began in April 2023, the world was watching closely. Cameras weren't allowed in the courtroom, but journalists filled the seats, typing out every moment. Family members sat just feet away from the woman accused of murdering her own children. Kay and Larry Woodcock, grandparents to JJ, listened through tears as prosecutors described how JJ's body was found bound and suffocated. Colby Ryan, Lori's surviving son, testified about losing not only his siblings, but also the mother he once loved and trusted. The defense attempted to cast doubt. They argued there wasn't enough direct evidence tying Lori to the actual killings. They suggested Alex Cox, who had since died, bore more responsibility. They tried to separate Lori's bizarre beliefs from her intent, but the mountain of evidence was overwhelming. It wasn't just that the children were found buried on Chad's land. It was the texts, the conversations, the patterns of behavior, the lies to police, the lack of any genuine concern for her missing kids. Every detail pointed back to Lori and Chad. In May 2023, the jury returned its verdict. Lori Vallow was found guilty on all counts. the murders of Tylee Ryan and J.J. Vallow, the conspiracy to murder Tammy Daybell, and charges of grand theft for stealing the benefits meant for her children. The sentencing was swift. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the first time, Lori's mask slipped. She no longer smiled in court. She no longer played the role of the carefree mother who claimed her children were safe. She was a convicted murderer, condemned to spend the rest of her life behind bars. As for Chad Daybell, his trial is still to come. He faces the same charges, and prosecutors have signaled they will seek the death penalty. His role as a self-proclaimed prophet, the man whose visions of light and dark spirits shaped every decision, will be put under the harshest scrutiny. And for the families of the victims, that trial will be another painful chapter in a saga that has already taken so much. The legal proceedings revealed more than just evidence. They revealed a tragic truth, that the justice system had been warned long before the murders happened. Charles Vallow's pleas to police in early 2019 had been ignored. Friends who raised alarms about Lori's erratic behavior weren't taken seriously. Even Tammy Daybell's strange account of a masked man in her driveway was brushed off. In retrospect, the signs were everywhere. But without action, the pact between Lori and Chad had been allowed to grow stronger until it culminated in death. The courtroom also became a place of reckoning for the broader community. How could faith be twisted so far from its original meaning? How could two people convince themselves that God wanted them to kill? And how could love between a mother and her children, between a husband and wife, be so easily replaced with delusion? For the families of the victims, justice brought some closure, but not healing. Kay and Larry Woodcock spoke publicly about their heartbreak, about how JJ's laughter and hugs were gone forever. Colby Ryan, Lori's surviving son, confronted her in a recorded phone call during the investigation, pleading with her to tell the truth, to stop lying, to honor the memory of Tylee and JJ. That call, filled with raw emotion, was played in court. It was a reminder that beyond the headlines, beyond the prophecies and delusions, this was a story of real children, real families, real lives destroyed. When Lori was let out of the courtroom after her sentencing, shackled and silent, the chapter closed on one half of the Doomsday couple. But the story is not over. Chad still awaits his trial, and the questions raised by their crimes continue to echo about belief, about manipulation, about how far people will go when they convince themselves they are chosen. In the end, the arrests, the trials, the convictions, they are the legal reckoning. But the true reckoning will always belong to the victims. To Tylee, who never got to finish her teenage years. To JJ, whose joyful innocence was silenced too soon. To Charles and Tammy, whose trust was betrayed and whose lives were stolen. They are the reason this case matters. They are the voices that must never be forgotten, even when the courtroom lights dim and the headlines move on. Themes and analysis. When the final verdict was read and Lori Vallow was sentenced to life in prison without parole, many people watching felt both relief and confusion. Relief, because justice had been served. Confusion, because even after months of testimony, evidence, and headlines, there was still the lingering question: how? How could this have happened? How could two people who, on the surface, seemed ordinary parents, spouses, members of communities slip so deeply into a world of delusion that they justified killing their own loved ones? The case of Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell is more than just a true crime story. It is a mirror held up to some of the darkest parts of human psychology. It shows us how love can become obsession, how faith can become fanaticism, how manipulation can become control, and how systems designed to protect the vulnerable can fail when warning signs are ignored. There are several themes that run through this story, and together they reveal why this case captured the world's attention. The first theme is the danger of unchecked belief. Human beings are meaning-making creatures. We look for patterns, we search for answers, and we often turn to faith to explain what we cannot control. Faith itself can be beautiful, a source of comfort, community, and hope. But when belief becomes unmoored from reality, when it is stripped of accountability, and used to justify harm, it becomes dangerous. Chad Daybell built a system of belief that gave him extraordinary power. He claimed to know who was light and who was dark. He claimed to see beyond the veil. He claimed to know when the world would end. These are not small claims. For someone like Lori, who was already searching for meaning and identity, Chad's words offered certainty. And in a world filled with uncertainty, certainty is intoxicating. But certainty can also be deadly. Because once you believe without question that you are chosen, that you cannot die, that you are on a mission from God, then anything is permissible. The rules of society no longer apply. The love between a mother and her children can be redefined. The sanctity of marriage can be discarded. Even life itself can be devalued, reframed as something disposable in the name of a higher calling. That is what happened here. Belief was not tempered by doubt. It was not balanced by accountability. It became absolute. And absolute belief, when built on delusion, leads to absolute destruction. The second theme is manipulation and control. Was Chad manipulating Lori, or was Lori manipulating Chad? This question has been debated endlessly. The truth is likely that it was both. Chad used his status as a self-proclaimed prophet to control Lori. He told her she was a goddess, that she was exalted, that they had been together in past lives. He flattered her, elevated her, and gave her a role that no ordinary life could ever fulfill. In doing so, he gained her loyalty. He gained influence over her decisions. He could label her husband dark, and Lori would believe him. He could say her children were zombies, and Lori would accept it. That level of influence is a form of control. But Lori was not simply a passive follower. She was charismatic, persuasive, and often the one who drove action. She convinced friends to listen to her strange ideas. She recruited Alex Cox to act as muscle, pulling him deeper into the web of lies. She lied with confidence to police, to family, to anyone who asked where her children were. In many ways, Lori weaponized Chad's prophecies to justify the decisions she already wanted to make. Together, they created a feedback loop. Chad gave Lori permission. Lori gave Chad purpose. Each manipulated the other, and together, they manipulated those around them. That is why this case is so unsettling. It shows how manipulation doesn't always look like one person pulling strings. Sometimes it looks like two people feeding each other's darkest impulses, until neither can see the truth. The third theme is the failure of systems. Over and over again, people try to raise alarms. Charles Vallow begged police to take Lori's threats seriously. He told them she believed he was possessed and that she wanted him dead. Friends noticed Lori's strange behavior, her sudden detachment from her children, her obsession with Chad. Tammy Daybell reported a masked man in her driveway just days before she died. And yet, time and again, these warnings were brushed aside. Police treated Charles as paranoid. Friends who spoke up were dismissed. Tammy's concerns were never followed up with urgency. Each time a red flag appeared, it was waved away. This is not to say law enforcement didn't care. But in cases like this, where the danger doesn't fit the usual patterns, where the threats are wrapped in religious language and strange beliefs, it becomes easy to underestimate. And in underestimating, lives were lost. This is a painful truth, because in hindsight, the path looks obvious. Charles's death was not an accident. The disappearance of two children was not a misunderstanding. Tammy's sudden passing was not natural. But in the moment, without the full picture, each event was treated in isolation. And by the time the system connected the dots, it was too late. The fourth theme is the cost of obsession. Lori and Chad's love story was not an ordinary romance. It was obsession disguised as destiny. They believed they had been married in past lives. They believed they were eternal partners chosen by God. They placed each other above everything else, above spouses, above children, above morality. Obsession is blinding. It narrows the world until only one person matters. In this case, that narrowing was deadly. For Lori, nothing was more important than Chad. Not her daughter, not her son, not her family. For Chad, nothing was more important than Lori. Not Tammy, not his children, not the vows he had taken. When obsession is cloaked in religious language, it becomes even more dangerous because it convinces people that their selfish desires are divine commands. This is why the story resonates so strongly with the public. We understand love. We understand faith. But what we struggle to understand is how love can become obsession, and how faith can become fanaticism, and how those two forces combine to destroy lives. The fifth theme is the resilience of truth. For months, Lori and Chad lied. They claimed the children were safe. They claimed nothing was wrong. They smiled for cameras, posed on beaches, and acted as though the world's concern was misplaced. For a time, it almost worked. They fooled police, family, and even friends. But truth has a way of surfacing. Shallow graves cannot hide forever. Lies cannot withstand evidence. Eventually, the masks came off, and the world saw Lori and Chad for what they were. The resilience of truth is also reflected in the families of the victims. Kay and Larry Woodcock refused to stop searching. They demanded answers when no one else could get them. Colby Ryan, Lori's surviving son, confronted his mother, begging her to tell the truth. Journalists followed the case relentlessly. Strangers across the country shared missing posters, held vigils, and prayed. The truth survived because people refused to let the lies win. Finally, the sixth theme is the victims' voices. In the courtroom, amidst the legal jargon and the evidence, it was the victims who mattered most. Tylee, 16, full of life and wit, protective of her little brother. JJ, just 7, a boy who loved hugs, who loved his grandparents, who loved the simple joys of being a child. Charles Vallow, who tried to save his family and was silenced. Tammy Daybell, who gave her life to a marriage only to be betrayed. They are the ones whose absence defines this case. They are the ones whose names must be remembered. Because in focusing too much on Lori and Chad, it's easy to forget that this story isn't just about criminals. It's about the innocent people who paid the price. The themes of this case: unchecked belief, manipulation, systemic failure, obsession, truth, and the voices of victims are why the Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell story will be told for generations. It is a warning, a cautionary tale, a reminder that no one is immune to delusion, that love can blind, that systems must listen to warning signs, and that belief without accountability can become lethal. And perhaps the hardest lesson of all, evil does not always come in the form of monsters. Sometimes it comes smiling, dressed in ordinary clothes, talking about God and love and destiny. Sometimes evil looks like a mother. Sometimes evil looks like a prophet. And sometimes evil looks like two people who believe they were chosen when in reality, they were only lost. Closing reflection. When all the evidence has been presented, when the verdict has been read, when the guilty are led away in shackles, what remains is not the courtroom or the headlines. It is the silence left behind by those who can no longer speak for themselves. In the case of Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell, that silence belongs to Tylee Ryan and JJ Vallow. It belongs to Charles Vallow. It belongs to Tammy Daybell. Their absence is the weight that lingers long after the cameras have gone. Tylee was 16, a teenager with her whole life ahead of her. Those who knew her remember her sharp wit, her humor, and her fierce loyalty to JJ. She was the kind of older sister who would roll her eyes at her mom's antics, but jump to defend her little brother without hesitation. She should have been worrying about exams, friendships, maybe her first job, the usual struggles of adolescence. Instead, her life ended in violence, her body discarded and burned as though she were nothing. But Tylee was not nothing. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, and she deserved a future. JJ was 7, a child filled with innocence and love. He adored his grandparents, Kay and Larry Woodcock, who still speak about him with tears in their eyes, remembering his hugs and his laugh. JJ was bright and full of energy, a boy who saw the world with wonder. He had challenges, yes, but he also had joy. He had the right to grow up, to learn, to play, to live. Instead, his final moments were bound in duct tape, his small body hidden in a shallow grave. But JJ was not a burden, not a possession, not an obstacle. He was a child, and his life mattered. Charles Vallow's absence is also felt deeply. He was a man who tried to raise the alarm, who saw clearly the danger his wife was becoming. He begged police to listen. He filed paperwork. He told friends and family that Lori was dangerous. He knew, and still he was silenced. His death was brushed off as self-defense when, in truth, it was the first step in a string of calculated removals. Charles was a father, a husband, a man who wanted to protect his family. He should have been heard. He should still be alive. And then there is Tammy Daybell. Tammy was married to Chad for nearly 30 years. Together, they raised 5 children. She was described as gentle, kind, and deeply committed to her family. She worked as a librarian. She supported her husband's writing. She lived her life quietly. She had no idea that her devotion would one day make her expendable in Chad's eyes. She trusted him, and he betrayed her in the worst way imaginable. Tammy deserved more. She deserved honesty, love, and a long life surrounded by the family she raised. When we speak about Lori and Chad, it is easy to become lost in the bizarre details that talk of zombies, light and dark spirits, past lives, and apocalyptic prophecies. These details are sensational, strange, and they capture attention. But if we only focus on them, we risk forgetting the heart of the story. This is not, ultimately, a story about visions and prophecies. It is a story about lives stolen, about children who never had a chance to grow, about spouses betrayed by the people they trusted most. It is also a story about the fragility of truth. For months, Lori and Chad lied. They told friends the children were safe. They told police the children were with family. They told the world that nothing was wrong. And for months, they smiled and walked freely while their victims lay buried in the ground. But truth does not stay buried forever. It surfaced, as it always does, and when it did, it exposed the hollow core of Lori and Chad's delusions. There's another silence, in this case the silence of systems that failed. When Charles begged for help, when Tammy reported the masked man, when family raised alarms, too often the response was disbelief. Lori charmed her way through interviews. Chad hid behind his books. Each red flag was dismissed as exaggeration, paranoia, or coincidence. And in that silence, the pact between Lori and Chad grew stronger. It is a painful reminder that we must listen to those who raise alarms, even when their warnings sound unbelievable, because the unbelievable can become real. This case also forces us to confront the darker sides of love and faith. Love, in its pure form, is selfless. It protects, it sacrifices, it endures. But love, twisted into obsession, becomes dangerous. Lori's love for Chad was not ordinary, it was absolute, consuming and blind. She placed him above everything, even her children. Chad's love for Lori was equally destructive. He placed her above Tammy, above his own family, above morality. Their love was not love at all, it was obsession disguised as destiny. Faith, too, in its pure form, can be a source of strength and hope, but faith without accountability, faith warped by delusion, becomes fanaticism. Chad and Lori cloaked their selfish desires in religious language, convincing themselves that murder was holy. That is not faith, that is corruption. And so, when we look at this case, we see not just the crimes of 2 individuals, but the broader lessons of human vulnerability. We see how belief can blind, how love can betray, how systems can fail, and how truth, though delayed, always emerges. For the families of the victims, justice provides little comfort. No sentence, no verdict can bring Tylee and JJ back. No trial can undo the betrayal of Charles or the loss of Tammy. Their grief is lifelong. But in speaking their names, in telling their stories, in refusing to let them be defined only by the way they died, we honor them. Tylee was witty, protective, and strong. JJ was joyful, innocent, and loving. Charles was devoted, persistent, and courageous. Tammy was kind, loyal, and gentle. These are the truths that must endure, long after Lori and Chad fade into prison walls. And perhaps that is the final lesson of this case. Evil often looks ordinary. It smiles. It waves. It blends into neighborhoods and communities. It doesn't always announce itself as monstrous. Sometimes, evil looks like a mother in a suburban home. Sometimes, it looks like a husband writing about the end of the world. Sometimes, it looks like 2 people who believe they were chosen when in reality, they were only lost. This story is shocking, it is disturbing, and it is tragic, but it is also a reminder that we must remain vigilant, that we must question when something feels wrong, that we must protect the vulnerable, and that we must never allow delusion to erase our humanity. for Tylee, for JJ, for Charles, for Tammy. May their voices never be silenced. May their names never be forgotten. And may their lives remind us of the cost of unchecked belief and the importance of truth. And to you, watching now, if you want to hear more stories where we pull back the curtain on the darkest corners of human behavior, don't forget to subscribe to Dark Truths, True Crime Stories. By subscribing, you help keep these stories alive. And by joining as a member, you can even request the cases and topics that matter most to you. Because together, we will keep telling the stories that must be told, and we will never forget the lives that deserve to be remembered. Viewer reflection. When a case like this ends when the verdict has been read, the guilty convicted, and the victims laid to rest, the world often moves on. Headlines fade, the next breaking story takes over, and people who were once at the center of global attention are slowly forgotten. But the families of the victims do not move on. For them, the grief is not a headline. It is a daily reality. A chair at the dinner table that will never again be filled. A laugh they will never hear. A hug they will never feel. That is the true cost of what Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell did. And so, as we close this story, I want you, the viewer, the listener, the person who has followed this journey with me, to sit with that for just a moment. Sit with the truth that behind the talk of zombies and prophecies, behind the sensational headlines of the Doomsday couple, this is about two children who should still be alive. This is about a husband who should have been protected, not betrayed. This is about a wife who should have grown old with the man she trusted, not buried under the shadow of his lies. Tylee Ryan should have had the chance to graduate high school, to discover her dreams, to laugh with her friends, to build a future. JJ Vallow should have had the chance to grow up surrounded by the love of his grandparents, to explore the world with the same curiosity and joy that made him light up every room. Charles Vallow should have been able to watch his children grow, to find peace after the storm he tried so hard to calm. Tammy Daybell should have lived to see her children start families of their own, to continue the quiet life she had built with such devotion. None of that was taken by fate. It was taken by choice. And that is what makes this case so disturbing. It is not just that Lori and Chad believed in strange ideas. It is that they made choices a lie, to manipulate, to kill. And every choice was justified in their minds by a delusion that they were special, chosen above the rules. That delusion cost innocent people their lives. When you and I hear this story, it's natural to ask, how does this happen? Could this happen again? The hard truth is yes, because the ingredients are not as rare as we'd like to think. All it takes is someone who craves control and someone who craves meaning. All it takes is unchecked belief, obsession disguised as love, systems that fail to intervene. When those elements collide, the result can be devastating. That is why we tell these stories. Not because they're sensational, not because they are shocking, but because they are warnings. They remind us of the fragility of human judgment. They remind us of the importance of questioning, of listening when someone raises alarms, of protecting those who cannot protect themselves. They remind us that evil often hides in plain sight, behind smiles, behind words about God and destiny, behind the faces of people we would never suspect. The story of Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell is now etched in history, alongside other infamous cases of family betrayal and religious delusion. But what we do with that story is up to us. Do we let it fade into memory? Or do we carry the lessons forward? Do we shrug it off as something bizarre and unique? Or do we recognize the warning signs that can appear in any community, any family, any person? For me, the answer is clear. We must carry the lessons. We must refuse to let the victims be forgotten. We must tell their stories again and again so that their lives mean more than the way they ended. And that is why this channel exists. Dark Truths. True crime stories is not just about crime, it is about memory. It is about making sure that Tylee, JJ, Charles, and Tammy are remembered not just as victims, but as people whose lives had value. It is about shining light into the darkest corners so that maybe, just maybe, we prevent another tragedy like this from happening again. So if this story has moved you, if you believe in keeping these memories alive, I ask you now, take a moment to subscribe. Subscribing ensures you won't miss the next story, the next case, the next voice that needs to be heard. And if you want to go even deeper, if you want to be part of shaping what stories are told here, consider joining as a channel member. Members can request cases, share their insights, and directly support the work it takes to bring these long, detailed documentaries to life. Every subscription, every membership, every comment and share it matters. It helps keep these stories alive. It helps honor the victims. It helps build a community of people who refuse to let the dark truths of the world go unnoticed. So, to you, the viewer who has walked with me through this case, thank you. Thank you for your time, your attention, your willingness to face the uncomfortable truths of human behavior. Together, we can make sure that the names of the victims are never erased, that their voices are never silenced, and that their lives are never forgotten. Tylee Ryan, J.J. Vallow, Charles Vallow, Tammy Daybell, we remember you, we honor you, and we will continue to speak your names. If you are new here, subscribe now to Dark Truths, True Crime Stories. If you are ready to support even more, join as a member and request the cases you want to see explored. And above all, never stop seeking the truth.